Welcome back. In this tutorial we create this artsy looping seamless animation in Blender from start to finish. It was created by using the real-time global illumination in EVEE, the SSGI, which is only available through custom build, so pretty new territory right there. And we'll create this quick and easy water splash. So right here in Blender, we add in our main camera, which is set to 1080p by 1080p perfect Instagram resolution. Let us delete our default cube, we don't need that, and add in a new plane, which will be our floor plane. Now here we'll build out our building, which is very minimalistic, very simple, nothing too fancy. We build up our walls. It looks kind of a bit Mediterranean, a bit futuristic. Really like this style. And to separate our side wall, in here we'll cut our main door, which will be kind of rounded on top. So let's cut 2 loop cuts and 1 right horizontal. Let's select both of these outer vertices and press Ctrl, Shift and B to bevel them. This creates horrible topology, but if we delete our main face of our door and do a limited dissolve on that, it will get rid of our main faces and leave us with an N-gun. By joining everything together and extruding this part, we will create a 3-dimensional door. And for our floor, let's inset our main floor face, scale it a bit on the y-axis and extrude it down to create this kind of swimming pool. And use the bottom face in a separate object for our main plane. Let's increase the lightness of the main scene a bit. Let's make it a dark blue, bluish, kind of purplish color. Add in a sun lamp. Make sure to enable ambient occlusion. I didn't show that, but ambient occlusion is pretty helpful. Make it very strong. As well as our sun lamp, which shines in through our door and throws this shadow right on the left wall. The sun lamp is very harsh, not too fuzzy, and this is a pretty cool style. I really like it. Give your light source a bit more angle, so this makes everything a bit softer. If you find yourself having very bad resolution there, try to increase the sampling in EVEE or try to increase the shadow map size, and this will get rid of that, but it will, of course, increase render times a bit. For this kind of night moon vibe, I think we can make our light a bit more bluish. You will really see that if you add volumetrics to our scene. Really nice effect there. Add in our main mesh, which will be a simple sphere with a subdivision surface modifier on top. Have a look at that in rendered view. And now let's create the moon texture, the moon shader. Is a bit more complicated. It's basically an emission shader with a bit of stuff added to it to make it look as cool as you saw in the preview. If we now use our build, our custom build, to which you can find the link in the description below, we can now enable this real-time SSGA, and it's absolutely incredible. It is rendered in real time and looks 100% like cycles. I really enjoy working with that. It's I discovered it only lately and I really like it. You can play around with the settings to change the distance of this effect, enable bloom to make it really glow. And this will be the basis for our tutorial. A lot of tutorials will follow using this real-time SSGA because it massively decreases render times while always looking pretty real. So I added a bit more contrast to our scene in the meanwhile, and because I've got some shading errors, especially in the corners, I added this solidify modifier to our building with negative thickness, so it is a bit thicker outwards, like you can see here, and this will get rid of these kind of light edges, which are an arrow. I don't know if it has something to do with this real-time stuff or if it's just EVEE, but yeah, this is a pretty quick fix. So now let's go on and have a look at our building, try to decrease the lightness of the environment color a bit, and make the Passepartout a bit stronger, because that's personal preference. I like to work this way. Okay, now let's have a look at our moon texture, which is pretty interesting because it is only illuminating the lighter parts. Of course, this is not a real moon, but it's a pretty nice effect. Let's increase the size of our working area a bit and have a look at this shader in detail. First up, we plug in a texture of the moon. You can find that on a link down in the description below. This is just this simple moon texture. It's a spherical texture. And since our sphere is already unwrapped by default, we can use that, increase the contrast a bit, and feed that right into our emission shader. And this will look something like this. It already illuminates our scene. So now let us give this some color. And I'd like to make a color gradient from a lighter orange to a more reddish color. I'm using this combination of the UV mapping and mapping node plugged right into a color ramp shader. This will create this gradient, black on the left side, white on the right side. And by changing these mapping settings, you can change the orientation of this gradient. It's not meant to be used like this, but it is a pretty easy hack to do that. You could also have added or add in a gradient texture, but this is a bit easier. And by feeding that into the strength input, you now can define where the mesh will be illuminated. And with a multiply node, you can change the intensity of that. And now I'm using the same gradient to give my moon texture a bit of color. I feed it through this mix node, which is set to a different blending mode. This will multiply our moon texture on top of our color gradient. And with this combination of strength and color, we get this pretty cool effect. Let's play around with the bloom settings to match them to your scene and change the multiply node before your strength input to change the intensity of that light.
If you liked the tutorial, consider supporting me on Patreon. With your support, I will not only have more time to create videos like these, but you will get access to a ton of bonus content. You'll get access to all of the Blender project files I use in my videos. You find the tutorials too fast sometimes? I've got you covered. Follow me step by step with full-length, real-time tutorial recordings. You'll get full resolution downloads of all the artworks and, best of all, Patreon-exclusive access to all of my CG assets to get your digital art to the next level. Just click the first link in the description or go to patreon.com/rescan. Thanks for your support and let's get on with the tutorial.
Let's have a look at the scene material. So we plug in a new texture right here, which will be this texture I found on textures.com, doing a simple shader setup here, unwrapping of course the room, and then I can massively decrease the bump mapping because it's way too strong for my taste. It should be only very small effect. I feel like the texture is a bit too small for my taste. Increase the resolution there. And now the most important part here is playing around with the roughness, because the interaction between glossy parts and more rough parts with this light make the scene look awesome. And I change the contrast, decrease the contrast a bit, and shift everything a bit to a more grayish tone to make only subtle contrast changes. So there are some wet pieces which kind of look more wet and some parts where the wall looks a bit more dry. Doing the same basically with the curves layer or the curves adjustment to keep the color detail in my main channel, in my color channel, but reduce the contrast a lot. You could have used the contrast and brightness nodes for that as well. Now let's create the water shader. I'm using a principal shader and I plug this water texture, which is a preset in Blender, right in. Let's have a look at that. Press Ctrl T with Node Wrangler and enabled to add a mapping node to that and rotate it on the Z-axis to make the water parallel to the camera. Add in a bit of detail and distortion to get rid of this uniform look and make some random waves, just like you see in nature. We use that map as a bump map, which is fed into our normal input of our principal shader. to create the waves. Basically, the material is just a very reflective, glossy material with a bluish kind of color. And it's really reflective, but the bump mapping adds the visual interest there. And it also can be animated, which we'll do later on. And again, this bump mapping should be very, very, very subtle and decrease it to a really low amount there. Let's make the color a bit darker and more bluish. These are not real colors, of course, of real water, but it's it's a creative piece, and that's totally okay to do so. Now, you can see if I rotate this, this really shows the effect of this global illumination, which is really, really awesome. And in combination with volumetrics, it really comes to shine. In the latest version, this really works pretty good. For the volumetrics, I add in a cube, which will be my volume cube. And in there I plug in this principal volume shader. Of course, plug it into the volume, not into the surface. Yeah, and I think now I realized that. Otherwise, it will look very dark. And yeah, now you can play around with the density, really decrease the density and increase the intensity of our sun lamp. And then you get these really, really nice light streaks going. Decrease it a bit as well, because I want the back wall to be visible still and not vanish in complete darkness. And in this lighting stage, it's all about finding the balance between our environment light, our main key light, and the scene emission. So this is important right here. And that's what I meant by decreasing the intensity a bit, because I felt like this was a bit too strong right here. And now we're gonna go over animating our scene, which is pretty fun. And I think I never did something like that on the channel, but we'll of course keep everything beginner friendly right here. So go a few frames ahead on the timeline and place a location and rotation keyframe right there. Go back to the beginning and move the sphere down below the scene at the same keyframe as right here. And you see the sphere popping out of the water. And of course, do the same thing on the end, because we want to have the sphere fly out of the frame. We want to keep a few frames of darkness right at the end, because if we loop our scene, like you see me doing here, this will look a bit more natural. So get rid of all the unnecessary keyframes like the X and Y and location and rotation, basically, because we only want to rotate and move our sphere on the Z-axis, which is pretty handy right here, and gets rid of a lot of unnecessary information. Okay, now I rotated the sphere in the beginning about 360 degrees on the Z-axis and placed 2 keyframes right there, and did the same thing at the end to make the sphere rotate as it flies out of the water. And now for the timings, we can select our keyframes and change the interpolation modes to make that start and end a bit more smooth, because at the moment it just starts, flies out of the water and stops. And by using the bounce interpolation on the start and end keyframes, this creates kind of this bounce effect and this kind of smoother animation. Not using it at the end, but at the start it looks really good, moving and spreading the keyframes a bit on the timeline to make it a bit slower and a bit more natural. Yeah, this really looks awesome. I've added in this keyframe right in the middle and dragged it a bit down on the Y-axis. This creates the illusion of it hovering in the air, because if this is a rule which is very true for all types of animation. Never ever have something standing still in the scene, completely still, especially organic parts or characters or things like that, because this really looks fake. It should be always should be moving, and even if it's just a very tiny move, and this really improves your animations right here. So I'm making a few changes to the timings here. So I'm dragging the position keyframes a bit on the timeline. So the position keyframing doesn't end where the rotation ends. This kind of offsets both animations and really enhances the look as well. And with these 2 or 3 very easy rules and techniques, you can create some pretty good looking, dynamic, and for most of all, real looking animations. Now let's look at our water and make the water move a bit. We don't use water simulations for that. We just animate our texture. For that, have a look at the scene in textured view and add a keyframe right at the start in your mapping node and right at the end as well. And change the location on which the texture is applied, so that makes it look like it's traveling from the camera, away from the camera, and yeah, you have to choose the right axis, of course, but it was pretty easy. You could animate the revolutions of your texture and go into that detail, but not doing it for the tutorial, but keep that in mind. So now let's, I think, yeah, have a look at our final animation. And we now need to work on one final piece, which is the water splash. We're not doing a water simulation, so you won't have these long render times and simulation times. Just select your water plane, give it a lot of resolution, and add a subdivision surface modifier with the simple mode to increase the resolution even more. And then we'll use dynamic paint to create this water ripple effect. Dynamic paint is typically used to paint on stuff, as it says, but it can also be used with a very specific setting to create water splashes. So I'm adding in my dynamic painter and my dynamic paint canvas and changing the type to this waves type. And now it uses our animation and our sphere, our painter mesh, to create this pretty nice water animation. You can change the properties of the water, how it behaves, how large those splashes are in the menu. Just copy these settings, try to play around with the dampening, which really changes the way the splashes look, and also the timing could be changed to make it a bit slower and a bit faster. And the faster your animation looks, the smaller it should be in real time, because large animations take a lot of time and smaller animations take a bit less. So play around with that, but I found these values are pretty good as a start. And this is it. So no simulation needed, pretty easy, and you're done with the scene basically. Now, as the last part, we will jump into the compositor and composite our scene. But before that, let us go into our settings and, yeah, I don't know, bake all dynamics. This is pretty important. So go into the water simulation, bake it down so you don't get any render errors and your animation is safe to the hard drive. So if you open your scene the next time, you won't have to redo this animation. I will go in and do some final corrections, for example, like shading everything smooth and adding a subdivision surface modifier right after my dynamic paint can improve the look of the scene. A thing I didn't show in the tutorial is I added a bevel modifier to my room, which created these tiny, very, very small bevels on all of the edges. And these catch the light and really make this look more real. Do that on every scene, even if it's a real or rendering or something artsy like that, it really improves your render. So now let's render one test frame, and if you're happy with that, go in, enable motion blur, do that. Set it to a very low amount because I don't want it to be overly prominent right here. Select PNG as the frames to render, RGB because we don't need the alpha channel, and render animation. Then jump into the compositor and load a movie or an image sequence. Select all of your rendered frames. Since EVEE, it didn't took a lot of time. It was pretty fast at my machine. And connect this to a viewer. And by scrubbing through the timeline, you can see how it looks. It's a bit contrasty at the moment. And that's because we've still got the color adjustments enabled in the general settings. And since we're using the same Blender project, we of course need to disable these and reduce the contrast by that, because these get applied after compositing. Now add in this color grading node, make the blacks a bit darker and the lighter parts a bit lighter. Give the blacks this kind of bluish tone, only very, very subtle, and the highlights this kind of yellow tone, yellow-orange. This is this typical split toning, orange and teal. This look is used a lot of times. Now reduce the factor right here. And now let's add in some camera imperfections, like this glare node, for example. Use this effect to create kind of these glares and these glows in the camera. You can simply copy these values right here and reduce the effect of this. You can play around with the mix value right here, and the most important value would be the threshold value. Always scrub through your timeline to see these effects at different timings. You can animate these compositor effects if you feel like they're a bit too strong. A thing I do on every render basically is add in a vignette. I do that by generating this ellipse and blurring it with a filter node right after. I feel like there should be a very simpler way to do that in Blender. A simple vignette node would be enough. I don't know why this isn't created by default, but you can do it pretty fast with this technique. Just use a mix node set to multiply the darker parts over, and use the factor adjustment to decrease the effect of this node. Make it 0.3% or something like that. And finally, go in and add some distortion to your scene. I'm mainly interested in the dispersion part of this node, because dispersion basically creates this kind of anaglyph effect where it splits the red and the green and blue channel, but especially at the outer parts of the image. This is an imperfection a lot of lenses have, and if added in a low amount, it makes it look a bit more real and removes this digital edge from your render. Before we render, keep in mind you can download the project files for this tutorial on my Patreon. Go to patreon.com/Rescan and have a look at that. You will find the project files of all the other tutorials there as well. Now let's hit render and enjoy our final animation. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. If you want, please subscribe to this channel, and again, check out Patreon for project files and a high resolution download.